Good evening and welcome to the Noir Crime Writing Festival 2021. My name is Nathan Ashman and I'm a lecturer in crime writing at the University of East Anglia. Noir is a partnership between the University of East Anglia and the National Centre for Writing. Very special thanks go to our festival sponsor, the Crime Vault, our booksellers, Gerald and Arts Council England for making this event possible. So thank you for joining us for this very special event with our most welcome guest, Steph Cha. So some Steph facts to start. So Steph Cha is a Korean-American crime writer and journalist and is the author of 4 novels, including a trilogy of private eye books featuring the reluctant detective Juniper Song. She's also a critic whose work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, where she also served as Noir editor. She is the current series editor of the Best American Mystery and Suspense anthology. Steph's latest standalone novel, Your House Will Pay, was published by Faber and Faber in 2019 and has gone on to scoop the Los Angeles Times Book Prize Award and the California Book Award. Your House Will Pay is an empathetic and gripping portrayal of 2 families inextricably linked by a terrible crime. Set mainly in present-day Los Angeles, the novel centers on 2 protagonists, Grace Park, a dutiful daughter trying to come to terms with her elder sister's estrangement from their Korean immigrant parents, and Sean Matthews, an African-American ex-con who is trying to help his cousin Ray adjust to life outside of prison. As another fatal police shooting rocks Los Angeles, Grace and Sean will soon come face to face with a shared legacy of trauma, injustice, and violence, one that threatens to destroy everything that they hold dear. Steph, thanks so much for being here today, and a huge congratulations on the novel, first of all. So before we launch into some questions and some chat, I think you've got a reading that you're going to do for us to kick things off.
Yeah, and hi, and thank you for the introduction and for having me.
No problem at all. It's great to have you.
So I'm just going to do a quick reading from one of the 3 sections that takes place in the past. So this is in 1992 about the uprising. It lasted 6 days. 6 days of fire, a judgment poured over the earth. Figueroa Liquor Mart was gone, and Frank's Liquor, Florence Liquor and Grocery, Empire Market, and Jingle Bell Liquor too. Laundromats were destroyed, the machines jacked for coins, dry cleaners looted, plenty of people grabbing the chance to take somebody else's clothes. Some places put up signs like lamb's blood on their doors, black owned, they said, and they were passed over, sometimes. Terry's Interiors got the torch, and Rod Davis Firestone, and the African Refugee Center. After a while, fire didn't discriminate. They called in the National Guard. 63 people were dead. Sean watched it all happen. When the law didn't come, the lawless spread out. There were bangers everywhere, bold because the police were gone, and because they had a truce for once, their priorities shifted away from each other. When they started getting crews together to ride up into Koreatown, Sean went with them, riding in the back seat of Sparky's grandma's Ford Escort, not even bothering to lie to Aunt Sheila. Koreatown, it was where the Koreans were. Chung Ja-han's people. The people who believed and supported her, who thought Ava was Han's bad fortune, a thing that had happened to her, like a car crash or a storm. It made sense to him to take this outcry to Koreatown. They would bring this judgment to them, to her community, her family, to her. When it was over, everything had changed. Wherever he went, he saw the extent of the ruin, the cooled remnants of days of unchecked wrath. Where there had been buildings, there were now building frames like children's pictures scribbled in pencil, gray and blurred and skeletal on the verge of disintegration. Roll-up doors defaced by graffiti and ash, the metal warped so they'd never close again. Rubble and trash littered the streets like fallen teeth, like dead skin, the rot of a ravaged body. The neighborhood looked like a war zone, a place like nowhere he'd ever seen outside of photographs. But he lived in it now, victim, civilian, soldier, insurgent. He was different, still changing, the core of him destabilized and reformed by the fire. He joined up with the Bering Cross Crips, Sparky vouching for him, saying he'd been through it, that he was stone cold for 14. Ray and Sparky and 4 other guys jumped him in at the parking lot of True Way Baptist the week after the uprising, the church's pink stucco walls charred black all the way up to the steeple. They formed a circle around him, each of them locking eyes on him and nodding, starting the ritual. Ray came at him first, and they swung at each other like they had a dozen times before, landing a punch each before the other boys moved in turn. He kept his fists up and gave them his best, and they knocked him down, each of them laying hands on him until he was on the ground. As he lay there taking hits, his muscles singing, the taste of blood in his throat, he gave himself over to the boys and the pain. How great it was, the controlled aggression of family, to know the hurt would never be more than he could stand.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steph. A brilliant section, and I think indicative of how beautifully you write about Los Angeles in this novel, and it's something I want to talk to you a little bit about later. But first of all, let's just kick off with a general question. I mean, how are you? How's the last kind of year or so been in this kind of crazy time? Are you okay?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's been a great year for me. We had our first kid.
Oh, congratulations!
3 weeks into lockdown, so it's mostly been kind of watching him grow. And we have childcare as of a few months ago, so I'm even able to work now. So it's been, I mean, it's been a strange thing. Everything is terrible. And reading the news, kind of keeping up with other people. I understand that the world outside of my household is kind of not in a good place. But we've been lucky, and we've had a pretty good year with our family.
Great, that's really, really good to hear. Okay, so Your House Will Pay is your fourth novel, your fourth crime novel, actually. So maybe we could talk a little bit, first of all, about crime mystery fiction as a genre. So, I mean, what is your relationship to crime fiction? Did you always go into writing thinking you were going to write crime or mystery novels? Was that always your intention?
No, I'm one of the crime novelists who came into it thinking, I would do this for one book. It was something I wanted to play with, and I also thought I could write a crime novel. I think when I started writing my first novel, Follow Her Home, I wanted to write a book that was in conversation with Raymond Chandler because he's kind of the big guy in LA, and I felt like I had things that I both admired deeply and also wanted to be in conversation with. And so I wrote this book that was kind of a response to Philip Marlowe and those novels, and I wanted to update them. Little did I know that this is a very common thing for crime writers to start out in a Chandler-esque vein. So I kind of came to obliquely because I studied Chandler in college and I was just a big fan. And I always thought that I would write, a literary novel afterwards. I wasn't thinking I was permanently a crime writer. And I think I just didn't know the genre that well. When I started writing, I was in my early 20s. And I didn't know other writers either. So I was kind of isolated and doing my reading and writing, and I didn't really know what to expect or I didn't have any long-term plans. But after I sold Follow Her Home, I was asked if I wanted to write a sequel, and then I had another idea for a crime novel, and so I wrote Beware, Beware. And by that point, between those two books, I had written 200 pages of a family novel that went nowhere. I haven't really gone back to it because I don't even know if there's anything worth salvaging. And then as I wrote Beware, Beware, and then I wrote Dead Soon Enough, I realized how much potential there is in crime fiction. Just the things that you can do in crime fiction that you can't really get away with in genres that are not so tied to the sense of place and social realism and I mean, especially noir. I come from a noir background, right? So hard-boiled detective fiction kind of has this tradition of challenging challenging kind of social injustice and looking at the kind of dark fissures that exist in every society. And I liked being able to do this in my fiction. And I realized, when people die, when people are killed, when there's violence, it really says a lot about about a place and the people who live there. And I wanted to keep looking at that. And so I guess that's kind of how I came to crime fiction and why I stayed. I came to it through this not quite random, but this narrow channel. And then I really liked what I found.
So your previous three novels, the Juniper Song trilogy, were all kind of private eye novels, like you said, very much in the Chandler-esque tradition. And as you mentioned about your first novel, Follow Her Home, it's actually very actively engaged with Chandler. The opening paragraph, for instance, is a kind of rewriting of the famous opening paragraph from The Big Sleep. So with a novel with Your House Will Pay, why did you set out to do something different? Did you feel hamstrung by the limitations of the PI novel? Were you hoping to do something with kind of broader brushstrokes? What kind of made you move on to a different kind of crime storytelling?
I felt hamstrung by the conceit in Follow Her Home more than I did in the next two novels, because, the amateur PI novel is actually a pretty hard one to write. It's not something I realized going into it. It was something I realized when I was shopping the novel and editing the novel, that it's hard to kind of justify why somebody who doesn't have a professional reason is like going around handling a murder mystery by herself.
There's always that logic problem, isn't there? Yeah.
It's like it was tough. So I needed to kind of generate, a convincing reason for her to be involved in this. Mm-hmm. And a piece of that involved kind of beefing up the Marlowe homage. Although that first paragraph was always the first paragraph, I was very curious about how it would read with a young woman describing everything she wears versus a kind of grizzled white man. But when I wrote my second and third novels, I had a great time. I didn't feel hamstrung by the genre at all. I felt like very free to do whatever I wanted because she had a case. She had a reason. She had buy-in. And I could also kind of distance her from the constant references to kind of Philip Marlowe, Raymond Chandler stuff, right? And so that was fun to have, to be in the genre, but not have to pay attention to the trappings of it constantly. So by the time I wrote Your House Will Pay, I was into those books, and I knew how to write them. But the next idea I had for a novel involved this, basically kind of writing the story of like a Sunjeju type character's family, right? This like killer from the early 90s. And it just didn't make sense as a PI novel. Certain stories lend themselves well to the PI character as this kind of central character. And this one, I knew that I was more interested in the family members of the shooter and the victim. And that's not really a PI novel. And so I wanted to spend time with these people who are not detectives and who do a little bit of detective work, sure, but not in the same way as an amateur PI. And so I ended up, I only realized this kind of when I had written almost all of Your House Will Pay, but I actually have two characters in there who are kind of more traditional mystery protagonists, which are, I have a homicide detective, and I have a journalist who are both in there. And they're actually also the two of the only white men in this book. And I realized later that like that in a traditional, in a kind of more mystery structured version of this book, that they would be the main characters. One of them would be, and that Grace and Sean, who are the protagonists, would be people that they speak to for one scene each. And you get a little bit of the flavor, you get a little bit of the grief and the emotion, and I just didn't want that. I wanted for this book to really dwell in the complicated emotions, and I think that's something that like PI fiction, it's a limitation of PI fiction, is that you can't spend your whole book kind of talking to and thinking about this like one set of people who are affected by a crime. You have to look at the whole picture, pick up all the pieces, and it's something I like about PI fiction. It's a series of conversations that kind of end with this big picture, right? But you have to mix it up. where you get the emotional heft is from the PI character herself. And in this book, I knew that that's just not what I wanted to explore. It didn't feel like a Juniper Song novel. And also, frankly, I felt like I was at the end of the road with my publisher, so like for personal reasons too. And I also felt like part of me was like, look, this is a series character who's been through so much in 3 books, and I'm trying to ground this character as much as I can in a realist version of Los Angeles. But at some point, she just runs into so many bodies that she becomes like a local celebrity just for being like the woman who runs into so many bodies, right? And so it kind of became time to leave her alone for a while. I also felt like I was having an easy time writing these books, and it wasn't teaching me anything new. And kind of the things that I was thinking about in Dead Soon Enough, the third of those books, thematically have a lot in common with Your House Will Pay. I was thinking about issues of legacy and inheritance. Like that was kind of the main thrust of that third novel, thinking about our ancestors and also the people who come after us, and what passes on, what emotions we feel as parts of a minority group. It dealt a lot with the Armenian genocide, actually, that book. And so it kind of translated it a lot of that carried over nicely into Your House Will Pay. And I also got to learn to write a different kind of novel while I was at it.
Brilliant. That's great. So just to kind of bore down into Your House Will Pay in a little bit more depth. So the novel opens in the immediate aftermath of Rodney King's assault by the LAPD and offers a fictionalization of the murder of 15-year-old Latasha Harlins, who you kind of re-narrativize as Ava Matthews in your novel. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this case for some people who might not know about it, and how you came to be interested in writing about this.
Yeah. So Latasha Harlins was a 15-year-old girl in South Central Los Angeles. In 1991, she walked into a convenience store and was accused by the shop owner of stealing a bottle of orange juice. They got in a tussle. Basically, the store owner grabbed her backpack. Latasha punched her, and then after that kind of tussle was over, Latasha turns around, and the store owner and there's video of this. The store owner gets a gun and shoots her in the back of the head, and she dies. The store owner was a Korean woman, middle-aged. At that time, a huge percentage of businesses in South Central, which is what's predominantly Black, were owned by Korean immigrants, and that had already led to a lot of tensions in that community even before this shooting. But when Latasha was murdered, that became kind of a flashpoint for these tensions. And then Sun Ja-do, the killer, was tried for murder, and she was convicted by a jury of voluntary manslaughter. And then the judge, who was a white woman, sentenced her to no jail time. So she got probation and a $500 fine. And this became an even bigger problem, a bigger tragedy, miscarriage of justice. And all of this kind of tracked pretty closely with the timing of Rodney King's beating and the no guilty verdict in the case against the officers who beat him. So Latasha was killed about 2 weeks after his beating, and the whole the trial and sentencing happened like shortly before the Rodney King verdict. And so these two cases were tied very closely in the minds of Angelinos, and I think at the time, nationally too, although we remember Rodney King more than Latasha Harlins because of the timing of the uprising in April 1992. But Latasha's murder was one of the reasons that Korean businesses were targeted in the rioting after the Rodney King verdict. And it still is kind of the prime example of tension between Black people and Korean merchants in Black neighborhoods. And I think Black Asian relationships generally, when there's tension, this case is referenced a lot. And it happened. It's been 30 years now since that murder, and I think it's still pretty salient in within activist communities, kind of within Korean American community. Definitely the memory of Los Angeles.
Yeah. So, I mean, you grew up in Los Angeles, Steph. Was this something you grew up knowing about this case and the history of these kinds of tensions, or was it something you've kind of come to latterly when you were researching this book, or has it always been with you as you've been growing up in Los Angeles?
I knew about Rodney King, and I knew that there were tensions between Black and Korean people in LA without really knowing why. When I was growing up, it's not something that my family really talked about. It was something that I kind of absorbed just by being around, I don't know, pop culture, maybe, I don't know. So it was only as an adult that I really kind of delved into these things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, just moving back to the novel for a second, that there's the kind of second present day narrative picks up. So we have the Rodney King beatings and that picking up at the beginning, and then we have the present day narrative, which picks up in the aftermath of another police shooting involving a young African American high school kid called Alfonso Curiel in the novel. And there's a really interesting section in the text where, in the aftermath, your protagonist Grace begins to feel her kind of outrage and distress begin to dissipate, partly due to revelations that the Curiel kid, quote, wasn't exactly a college-bound Boy Scout. And it got me thinking about the murder of George Floyd, and how victims of police violence more broadly are often called out for previous crimes or transgressions, almost as a way of justifying or mitigating the violence itself. How do you feel your novel reflects on the kind of politics of victimhood, and was this something that you were interested in exploring?
Yeah, that was actually one of the main things that I wanted to explore, this idea of the perfect victim, the way that people who can no longer speak for themselves are kind of put on trial for their own murders in this strange, perverse way. There was a version of this book. When I was noodling around with titles, I was thinking, if I could kind of bring in the no angels thing into the title in a way that wasn't cheesy, I would do it, I remember after Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, there was a New York Times headline that I think was pretty famous, is still pretty famous, that said he was no angel. And you see this over and over again, these minor infractions that even in the most ridiculous, fundamentalist, punitive country could not be considered capital offenses, being brought up to justify slaughter. And I was interested in this both from that perspective of okay, why does our system insist on doing this? And in the way that we as civilians who are constantly overwhelmed with news process this kind of information. And also the way that the families of victims present their loved ones who've been killed. I think I forget. I don't even remember which police murder this was, but I remember seeing footage of a mother kind of pleading with the public about how her kid was this good kid who was going to go to college, and being so struck by that because she shouldn't have to do that. But you also understand why she does, because there is a desire to get the public to care. It's so hard to get people to care, I think. And I honestly think it's not because we're bad, it's that there's too much to take in. You can't process everything all at once. And so I think there is a sense in which if you have a reason to let go of a story in your brain, you'll take it. It might not be conscious, but it might be as simple as, oh, that kid wasn't going to amount to much anyway. Oh, that kid was trouble. that guy was, a petty criminal, and I think we just turn off to that news. And that incentivizes parents, family members of people who are killed in these horrific ways to kind of do their best to turn these people into saints, because they are competing for media space, for mental space with all the other people who are killed in the same way. It's this constant beat of horrific tragedy and violence. And in a way, it is a media war. You got to think about, it's not coincidental that like George Floyd's killer went to jail, went to prison. It was like the first cop convicted of murder in Minnesota in like decades. And that George Floyd's murder generated all this protest. I mean, it's impossible to think of those things as unrelated. The public outcry led to this very rare result. And so, I'm not even going to say if I were the mother victim, because I think it is different for Black families. But I think that like for Black families who lose children, who lose loved ones in this way, there's a script, and there are real consequences for going off that script, I think. And I think it makes us all simpler, and I don't know. I mean, because I can't blame them, but it does make it harder for us to see innocence where there's innocence that is kind of complicated.
And we see this in the novel with Sean's, the issue that Sean takes with the journalist Jules Searcy, and he describes him at one point as the gentle face of power, because although Jules has written this definitive book about the Ava Matthews case, he feels the book has actually stripped Ava of her nuance, of all the things that made her, in order to kind of, as you say, present this narrative of an angelic victim. And that's his kind of real issue with this journalist. Even though the story is getting out there, he can't bear the fact that it's not actually the truth. I thought that was a really fascinating aspect of the novel. Oh,
thank you. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of there's this constant conversation going on between Sean and his Aunt Sheila, who is very much somebody, and she's the one person in the book who was really modeled after a real person. Latasha Harlins' aunt, Denise Harlins, she became an activist after her niece's murder, and really she would kind of beat the drum. She would show up to things. She would make sure that Latasha's name stayed in the news. She advocated for other Black children, and became like a pretty important member of the activist community in Southern California. And I wanted to have that push and pull between Aunt Sheila and Sean. I'm also interested in the ways that people can be right and wrong at the same time, and how, and because I don't think either of them is right or wrong, or they're both right and wrong. I think Sean has a point. But I also think that Aunt Sheila did a lot to kind of keep Ava's name in the news, and without her, a lot, the memory would have died for a lot of people, even if it's just that it got corrupted for Sean. His kind of private memory and his private grief have been infringed upon in a way that isn't fair. But neither is the memory of his sister dying in the public imagination either. And so I kind of wanted to look at that, the way that being victimized put both of these people, who I think have, some moral bones to them, in kind of an impossible situation where they have to make compromises. There's no way to be perfect, given those cards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the novel plays with ideas of ambivalence in really interesting ways outside of this. I mean, one of the kind of key tensions in the novel is between Grace and her mother, Yvonne. That whilst Grace wants to defend and protect her mother from recrimination, she's also appalled by what she did to Ava Matthews. And this sense of dissonance, I think, really permeates the text and extends to the reader. You feel it as a reader. How important was it for you to show these two seemingly conflicting sides of Yvonne's identity? And was this a difficult thing to do?
Yeah. She's the one character who I think I have the least empathy for, I will say. And the reason is that, the real Sunjetu has never expressed any real remorse for what she's done. And so I wanted to carry that into Yvonne's character, that she's somebody who will never truly regret what she did, except in this self-pitying way. And I didn't want to clean that up in my version, which means that she's the character who I think is the least respectable, sympathetic. However, I know that the way that we treat strangers and the way that we treat our families, these things have almost nothing to do with each other. I think that the desire to protect your own is almost universal. And the desire to shut out strangers is not. And so I wanted to look at this person who's racist, who's a killer, and who's also a great mother, because I think I've seen so many depictions of racists in media where they're just unrecognizable as people. But I truly believe that a huge percentage of this country is racist, and that a far smaller percentage are just terrible parents and terrible sisters and brothers, impossible to talk to about anything or have dinner with. Like, I think that's not true. I think there are a lot of people who have horrible political beliefs and I do think that makes them horrible people. I actually do believe that. But are able to conduct personal relationships in a loving way, because that's about them. That's about kind of their circle, the in-group, right? The way we treat in-groups versus out-groups. It doesn't really make you a good person to love your kid. And so I wanted to kind of show this, though, because I think it's, and I think this is something that, like, everybody discovers sooner or later, that people they love hold horrible beliefs and think about how it affects you. Obviously, not all of us have family members who have straight up committed crimes against these other people, but I think that complication is there for all of us. And so I wanted to kind of stick my thumb in there and take it to the extreme, and look at, what does it mean? Like, this person, like, your mother did something awful. It has nothing to do with you, and yet it incriminates you. So how do you handle it? And that's actually that was kind of where this whole book came from, was that idea of the mixture of judging someone and loving someone, and how you can reconcile those. And I think the answer is you can't. And so that's why I thought the book would be interesting to write, because I truly think it's not reconcilable. There's something that's lost there, no matter what.
Completely, and we see that in Grace, and the way there's a section in the novel. I mean, the novel also deals, I guess, in a kind of relatively semi-tangential way with social media. And there's a moment in the novel when Grace is caught on camera defending her mother's actions in a moment of kind of profound emotional distress, which then forms part of a kind of lynch mob against her on the internet, and she's kind of vilified for her beliefs. And why did you decide to include this social media aspect in the novel? Was this just because that's the world we live in, or is it something that you're interested in as well, about the kind of the polarizing discourse that we see on social media?
It's both. I think that in a novel about social movements, you can't ignore social media. I think, or if you do, it no longer exists in the same world that we live in, and I wanted it to feel like it existed in that world. And so I wanted to pull in social media because that's where a lot of this unfolds. That's kind of the first battleground for a lot of these stories. They break on Twitter first. And so I wanted to make sure that was in there. And it just made sense to me to have Grace be part of this in this way, because I think she's such a private person in such a small bubble that I wanted to kind of expose her to the world at this vulnerable moment. I thought it would be good for her character development, but also, and I also wanted to kind of show, I guess this book deals so much with the people behind the headlines, right? And so the people behind the like viral video is kind of a corollary to that. And I don't necessarily believe that we need to accord, I don't think we have to like examine the humanity of every single person who goes on a racist rant at a Walmart. Like, we don't need to do that. Like, that's not our responsibility. It's their responsibility to keep to kind of watch themselves. I do think that, but that doesn't mean that I don't think there are stories there. And I think that, we catch people out at their worst moments, and then we judge them and we never think about them again. And again, this is just how we process information. And I don't necessarily think that it's something that needs to change. It's just this uncomfortable thing about being human, is that we only have this much attention that we can pay at any given time, right? But I wanted to kind of look at the results of that on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier about inheritance being a key theme in the novel, but both, I guess, in regards to what we inherit from our parents, but also this idea of an inherited trauma. And there's a quote on page 69 where I'll just read from the book. It says, "The kids knew the family history, but they hadn't been there when Ava died, when Aunt Sheila learned that she could trade their pain for attention, which at times felt almost like justice while being nothing like it at all. Daryl and Dasha were angry, sure, but that anger was inherited, abstract, and bearable. They could indulge it without getting burned." It's one of the key themes of the novel, isn't it? Inherited trauma. Why was this of particular interest to you, Steph?
Yeah, I think I had been thinking about this, like I said, with the last novel. I mentioned that novel had to do with the Armenian genocide. But the reason I wrote that novel was in part because it was my way of talking about kind of the trauma of Koreans and their resentment of the Japanese that lasts to this day. And the reason that those things exist, both the kind of resentment of Armenian Americans over 100 years later, and Korean Americans, decades later, is that the Turkish government, the Japanese government, have never fully owned up to what they did. And so I was interested in that idea, how that kind of lack of remorse, and also that divergence in storytelling can have these effects 100 years on, more than 100 years on. And I think that's something that we also see. We see that in the U.S. all the time. We're literally having a culture war right now about critical race theory, which isn't critical race theory. Like, I actually went to law school and attended a critical race theory conference in the late 2000s, in the late aughts, right? Like, critical race theory is something that law students have conferences about. It's not what's being taught in any classroom at an elementary school, whatever level. But critical race theory is suddenly this talking point. But really, all it is that there's a certain segment of the U.S. population that just doesn't want their kids to learn about the true history of slavery, and certainly doesn't want any of these children to grow up being able to draw the very strong connections between our history of slavery and all of the social inequalities today, kind of these vast differences in access to wealth and education and housing. That's not something that a lot of Americans want to deal with. So I wanted to kind of look at that idea of inheritance too. Obviously the inherited trauma, but also kind of the secondary effects of that inheritance of trauma. Like, what does it do to your family, both in a psychological way and in a material way? And we do see that with the Matthews family and the Holloway family, and with Grace's family. you kind of see the immigrant version of that American inheritance. I do think that that legacy of slavery, the legacy of genocide, is part of the package of being American. And I think that immigrants, when we come here and when we become American, and when we have our kids grow up here, I grew up here, but my parents came here voluntarily. I think you take up that inheritance too. And I think immigrants don't really know how to wear it, but neither do third, fifth, 10th generation Americans, right? I think there is this constant there's either a struggle or there isn't. Sometimes there just isn't a struggle. Sometimes it's just, I'm going to ignore all of this. And I think that is the easiest path of least resistance for a lot of people. And I think it is deeply irresponsible and immoral. But I think that for people who decide to try, there's a real reckoning that has to happen where you try to understand your relationship with the history of the country that you live in and that you love and that you care about. And so, Grace's journey is kind of like the second generation Korean American version of that. But I think it's like a very American story, just that coming to terms with a horror that you didn't want to know about, that you wish you had never found out in some ways. And so that's kind of what I wanted to look at, the two sides of that trauma. How does it filter down to the side of the perpetrator and to the side of the victim? And I'm looking at it through this one small set of characters, this one incident. But I think the same struggles, the same kind of calculations, the same negotiations, I think they're happening every day, everywhere. Certainly in this country.
Absolutely. And because whilst the novel ostensibly explores divisions between these two communities, the Korean community in Los Angeles and the African American community in Los Angeles, the specter of kind of white power looms pretty large in this novel. Like even in kind of, I guess, softer ways or perhaps more pernicious ways in characters like Jules and Blake, who are kind of on the peripheries of the text. And towards the end, Grace realizes that the system itself is broken. She has this realization that things aren't quite fair and reasonable. Was kind of the different workings of white power something you were interested in exploring in this novel? Because we do see it, I think, in different ways. Was there something that you were keen to explore?
Yeah, I mean, this is a book that mostly does not deal with white people. It's in the foreground. You have this Korean family and you have this Black family, but the background is white supremacy, because that is. America was built on it. All these systems that govern our lives were built to respond to and to serve white people at a time when, Asians were barely here. And when we were here, we're like building railroads and stuff like that. We were not, under horrible circumstances, we were not equals. And Black people were enslaved, right? So, so white supremacy is just the backdrop. It's also what makes the dynamics between the Korean and Black communities in South Central came out of white supremacist policy too. I mean, it came out of racist housing covenants. It came out of it came out of the government deciding that like the best place to put a freeway was in the right through a Black residential neighborhood, right? So like all of the soil, everything that made this story possible comes from that history, those trappings of white supremacy. And so I think like the book is not about white supremacy in the foreground, but that's the setting, that the setting is a white supremacist society. But it's not like science fiction or speculative fiction or anything. That's just where they live.
Exactly, and everything we see is a consequence of that larger structure of power, isn't it? It's kind of peering back behind the curtains. That's what's kind of behind it. I thought the way you dealt with that was really, really fascinating. Just moving on to, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Los Angeles, which is obviously the city that you grew up in. It's where all of your novels have been based. Is that right? Yeah, they are. All the Juniper Song recipes are in Los Angeles. Obviously, this one's also in Los Angeles. I mean, I guess the city is of interest to you because you grew up there, but I'm also interested in why you think it's proved continually such fertile ground for noir writers and crime writers. What is it about Los Angeles that keeps bringing these stories to that particular locale?
There's a very famous Mike Davis thesis about this, which is that Los Angeles is this city of sunshine and noir. It's a place that had, I think his thesis, which he outlines in a chapter of City of Quartz, is that LA had a pretty spotty municipal history, and that instead of that municipal history, we understand our city and its foundation through the tradition of noir. So anyway, I think that history is probably, it's probably a little dramatized, that thesis, but what I do find compelling is this idea that, LA is, because of Hollywood and because of the weather, it has this kind of golden image, right? It has this dreamland, La La Land image that attracts people, and it's full of promise. And I think that promise, that kind of golden promise, that ability to realize your dreams is, because that exists, it's just devastating when it doesn't pan out, because where else can you go? Because it's kind of the end of the line. It's kind of the frontier, right? So there's a heartbreak there, and there is a loss that doesn't exist in other places. And I think, and I do think that's why, I feel like when people talk about like crime in Los Angeles and crime fiction in Los Angeles, there's always this idea of the seedy underbelly, right? And it's only a seedy underbelly because the overlay is so bright and shiny. And I think that contrast is endlessly appealing for writers, and I think it's also true. You see it all the time. This kind of you go outside and you see it. It's both a place that I love dearly and that I find endlessly exciting, and it's also a place with incredible inequality. And I feel like I end up writing things that are critical of Los Angeles, but it's also my favorite place. And I think that kind of, it's such an eclectic place where everything is happening, at the same time. And I think that's what makes it interesting for fiction writers. All these opportunities for collision between, different communities, different people. I think that makes it ripe for crime fiction too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the kind of the dream and its dissolute double, isn't it? It's the nightmare underbelly. It's obviously, you said, a grand theme in a lot of crime writers, but James Arrow, for instance, is this kind of continuing theme throughout it. And it's the kind of scandal rag dichotomy, isn't it? Here's these celebrities, but also here's these celebrities doing the very worst thing that you would expect. Brilliant. Thanks, Steph. So actually, speaking of long kind of established crime writers of the genre, you've spoken elsewhere of your love of Chandler and Hammett, or as you put it, the dead white men who define my genre. And this continued whiteness of the mystery writing community is something that you've written about elsewhere. And I saw in research this that you had a run-in with Otto Penzler, who kind of railed against you and Attica Locke in this kind of super hostile and kind of strange open letter. Was that really dispiriting? Like, did that bother you, or was it kind of like, well, you're kind of proving my point here?
It was annoying. That was in response to a article I wrote about Linda Fairstein, actually, and her kind of continued presence in the mystery community.
Because she was up for a golden, she was up for a lifetime award, wasn't she?
Grandmaster Award. I think like by the time that letter came out, like I met Otto a few times. We don't have like a close personal relationship, obviously. And I've been around since 2013 is when my first book came out, and I've seen the genre change a lot. The kind of people who show up at conferences. I used to consistently be the only non-white person, the only woman on a panel, and also the youngest person. Like I would be in rooms full of older white people, and it's just something I kind of took as par for the course. But now I go to these conferences and it's just a lot more diverse. It's younger. There's a new energy, and I think the genre is shifting in a way that I find really encouraging. So I mean, I wasn't, to be honest, that upset about the Otto letter. It just felt like a last gasp of a certain kind of approach to the genre. And yeah, I mean, obviously he's not my favorite person. We don't hang out. But it was just like a personal attack. I can't really, what else to make of that, right? But
he attacked Attica Locke
I never
as well,
felt like I was in the wrong, and I also never felt like people were on his side either. I felt very supported. If anything, I feel like that was like a great thing that he did for my career. I feel like it raised my profile. Just having this kind of representative of like the old guard of the genre just come after me in that like very personal way. I think like it showed me kind of who my friends were in a very and it was like very encouraging.
Yeah, great. Well, that's good. I'm glad it's actually done some good in some way.
And I now edit Best American.
Exactly.
After he advocated
which is kind of the
ultimate.
ultimate.
My LA Review of Books job, I left that job to kind of take over his gig.
Yeah, I bet he loves that. I'm slightly conscious of time, but I did want to ask you. Before this, I asked some of our crime MA writing cohort to push some questions towards you. So we run an MA where our students write a crime novel in over 2 years. So there's a few questions right here. I think more crafty questions that I just want to quickly ask you if that's okay. So the first is related to your household place specifically. I mean, how long did it take you to write this? How easily did this project come together?
It took me a long time. It took me 4.5 years from beginning to end. A lot of revision time. It was not an easy book. I probably, from whatever in my next book will be, I'm not planning to spend that long on it. I felt like I had to learn a lot of new skills writing this book. I think the biggest one was that I had never written a Black protagonist before, or even a male protagonist before. And so it was just different, learning that voice and also kind of figuring out that family. That was a challenge and involved a lot of editing. But also, like, this is the first book I wrote in third person. It was the first book I wrote that didn't have a traditional kind of mystery spine, which, by the way, like, does make, I think the trappings of genre do make it easier to write plot. I think it's hard to write it's hard to plot a novel when there isn't some kind of skeleton
momentum driving.
And so I had to figure out different ways to introduce tension, and so there was just a lot of skills I had to learn while writing this book. So it took a long time. But again, a lot of it was editing, and also the first third took like 2.5 years, and then after that, it happened pretty fast. I felt like.
Yeah, so it came together faster at the end when you had to kind of figured all that stuff out. So how do you approach your writing generally? I mean, it might have been different, I guess, with this one compared to your 3 previous novels. But do you tend to be a kind of detailed planner? Do you begin with a big kind of superstructure, or do you kind of write as you go? A bit of both.
I would write as I went, but I think that from now on, I'm going to try to outline more. Because I was writing as I went, and I ended up kind of treading water a lot. And eventually I had to kind of plot out the last third. It was because I sold it on a partial. And so I submitted like the 2/3 that I had written. And then I had to tell my editor what was going to happen. And so I had to figure out what's going to happen. And I wrote out the outline. I forced myself to sit down and write out the outline. It took me 1 day to write the outline for the last third of the book. And it made the writing of the book so much easier that I'm just like, I guess I wasn't an outliner, and now I think I'm a convert.
Yeah. Just because it's the speed that you wrote about after you did that.
It just
so
made
going
everything...
forward, lots of outlining.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you working on now, Steph? You mentioned that you're starting to work again. Could you give much away about what you're working on? Is it another standalone? Is it a continuation of the Juniper Song mysteries, or something completely different?
I'm just in the kind of planning stages of another novel, and it'll be another standalone. But I am like really in the planning stages. I mean, literally, like last week, I was going through my Goodreads and looking at books I like and thinking, what is the engine of this book? And I have like in a document kind of trying to kind of take apart like these books and figure out like how they work. I'm kind of in that stage of plotting a novel where I'm like, what is a novel? How do you write one?
Bringing it right back to basics. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have some, and I feel like I didn't have to do this with the second and third books because they were Juniper Song novels, but I had to do it with this last one. And there's just this complete loss of confidence that I can even write a novel at all. And the only thing that makes me think I can do it is that I've done it before. And so I'm kind of in that stage now.
Yeah, great. How about just in your reading? Is there anything that you've read recently that you've really enjoyed, either inside the crime genre or outside? Anything you've picked up recently you've enjoyed?
Yeah, I just read both of S.A. Cosby's last novels, Razorblade Tears and Blacktop Wasteland, and they were so much fun. I mean, actually, when I say I've been looking at the engines of novels, part of it is because I read those two novels back to back, and they just run. And I've never written a novel like that, where they just kind of soar on this great premise and just are so action driven. And I don't think I can write a book like that. It's just not. I don't know if I have it in me, but those books are so much fun. I'm reading right now Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff because I'm going to review her next novel. And so I figured I've had this on my shelf and it's really good. And I'm also going through like all of Colson Whitehead's books because I'm profiling him. I do a lot of freelance work, so that's actually a lot of the writing I've been doing for the last year and a half has been kind of freelancing. I read a lot of book reviews. I've been doing kind of profiles of authors and Colson Whitehead. He's an amazing writer. I just read John Henry Days, which is an earlier novel of his. Incredible. It's so funny. It's strange. It's experimental. Just a wonderful book. And I love the Nickel Boys. And his new one is a crime novel called The Harlem Shuffle that's coming out in September. So I haven't read that yet, but I'm really excited to crack into it because I think he does some really cool things with genre. Even before writing an explicit crime novel. Yeah,
great, fantastic. Well, Steph, I think we're probably getting towards the end of our time, so I don't want to keep you for too much longer. So just to say again, a massive thank you for coming along and speaking to me today. It's been such a pleasure to have a chat with you about this book. And to anyone who hasn't gone out and bought this book yet, please do. It's a fantastic novel. Your house will pay. Do go and read it. It's great. It will blow you away. Thanks so much again, Steph.
Oh, thank you so much.